like to thank you for coming out to Barnes & Noble today.
Yeah.
Tracy.
This is Russ McLogan, who is here talking about his book Coming of Age during World War II, actually titled Boy Soldier. And he's going to be speaking first on his experiences that led him to write his book, and then we'd like to...
Trained to be a rifleman. I'd never fired a rifle in my life. I grew up in the city of Detroit. We didn't have that hunting heritage.
Yes, it is.
Was it good?
This was a new experience. I was trained to be a rifleman and sent over as a replacement. This is really a horrible experience because you're 18 years old, you've had a few months training, you are expected to replace a veteran soldier who had been in, some of them had been in combat for a couple of years. They were old, they were 28, 29. I illustrate my book with one of Bill Walden's famous cartoons. Probably, you might have seen this cartoon because he's quite famous. So it shows a little boy replacement taking the place, here he's sent over there and these guys have been through the mill. Willie and Joe there. He's supposed to take your place. So that was my role in the war. You can picture, let me give you a little background of this first meeting. I was an engineer for 40 years, and when I went to retire, I decided to be a writer. I took creative writing classes. My teacher had a little drill that she'd like us to do. She wanted us to write a passage which would show all 5 of the senses, seeing, hearing, tasting, feeling. So I thought I would do that about my first experience in combat. And I wrote it in a kind of a stream of consciousness type of writing. And you can visualize an 18-year-old boy, very immature, joining the hardened infantry rifle company. It's been in battle quite a while. It was in the Philippines and landed in Lingayen, the shores of Lingayen Gulf, driven down the Central Valley, were engaged in the Japanese. The Japanese had a series of fortifications about 30 miles east of Manila. They called it the Shimbu Line. And the strategy of General Yamashita was he didn't want to fight the Battle of Manila, but it was fought against his orders. They were to withdraw to the hills and then dig in, caves, trenches, whatever, and give the army, lead the army as they tried to take these hills. And of course, they were important because they controlled the water supply of Manila. Manila had a population of 1 million people, so the army was quite concerned about getting these dams into American hands. 63rd Infantry Regiment, which I joined, had taken this hill complex. It's called Hill ABX. It fought a vicious battle. They had lost a lot of men. And then I came up to replace somebody. So this passage, I try to use all 5 of your senses. Listen to this. I write, I had just missed the excitement of taking the hill, but I still remember vividly the ensuing weeks when we just sat there and held this precious ground. My memories are deeply engraved, enhanced by sensory perceptions, and at times the sights, the sounds, the feelings can be experienced again and again. Our artillery shells make a pleasant sound, kind of like the rustle of leaves as they pass overhead, and like distant thunder when they land on the Japanese over the hills across the Mango River. Incoming is a different story, a loud whistling noise that increases in intensity and ends in the loudest bang I've ever heard. I press against the saving earth and feel my heartbeats shake my whole body. Terror is physical. I peer out into the darkness, straining to see or hear anything that indicates the enemy is abroad at night. They may be trying to sneak up and retake this hill. Behind us, from the 1,000-foot altitude of Hill A, myriad lights, vanilla, gleam in the distance like stars. It's hard to believe that people are going about their business in the shattered pearl of the Orient while we sit in our foxholes and worry about the Japanese on the next hill. During the day, the flies are numerous, pesky, crawling over everything and swarming in black clouds when disturbed. I lie in my foxhole, smoking cigarettes. I lose count as I swat and kill them. It must be in the hundreds. I know their source, dead bodies. Carabao, which is like a big oxen, was killed near the bottom of the hill where we go for supplies or an occasional hot meal. The stench of decaying flesh is overpowering, wrenches your stomach. You breathe deeply as you pass by. Massive maggots feed on the rotten carcass. By sheer numbers, their chewing makes a buzzing sound as the putrid carrion slowly disappears. Soon, all that will be left are bones. From death comes new life. One dead carabao equals a million new flies. Time passes. It's Sunday. We are notified that Catholic Mass will be held at the bottom of the hill. It is a welcome relief from the boredom and the excitement at the top of the hill. The familiar ritual soothes, helps me forget the insanity of war. I remember going to Mass every day at St. Benedict's School. The church is full of children, packed into pews by classes, interspersed with black-robed nuns. Back in the 5th grade again. Charlie Ford, my first altar boy partner, gives me the elbow. Hard. I hit him back. Sister Rosemary sees just me, makes me sit next to her for the remainder of the service. I'm in disgrace for acting up in church. I think of Charlie now, because a recent letter from home reminds me he is dead. Killed in a training accident while learning to be a turret gunner in a Navy torpedo bomber. My generation is not even safe in the United States. The priest, Captain Ralph Dietz, assistant regimental chaplain, sets up the altar on the hood of a Jeep. His muddy combat boots stick out incongruously from the bottom of his silky, brocaded vestments. He speaks of Christ's suffering and how we can share in them by offering up our own misery for the reparation of sins. The congregation is intensely reverent, kneeling in the dirt, some with rosaries clutched in their grimy hands, others wearing them like good luck charms around their necks. Others have their heads buried in their arms, supported by their rifles, or hold their helmets reverently to their hearts. We are praying for deliverance, physical salvation. Lord, from the depths of our souls, we cry unto thee, get us out of here. Get a beer ration. 3 cans per man. I'm only 18, too young to be drinking beer, let alone to be here in combat. care for beer anyway. My father's an alcoholic, and my grandmother speaks often about the evils alcohol brings. I drink one can. It's warm and sour tasting. I'm offered money for the other two. So I sell them to an older soldier for a peso a can. He really appreciates it. Those 5 cans, he might blot out the horrors of war for a brief time. I blot out the war by thinking how nice it would be to take the Woodbridge streetcar, the river, and bottle of boats, or dock. Furner's company had its plant. There's a great, sweet, tangy ginger ale, aged 4 years in wood. I think Pepsi-Cola would taste real good too, especially with potato chips. The world's first singing commercial comes into my head. Pepsi-Cola hits the spot. 12 full ounces, that's a lot. Twice as much for a nickel too. Pepsi-Cola is the drink for you. All the Army gives it something. I think about the last time I went to Babel, the only boat rides I had before the big boats brought me to this green hell. It's the day of the annual Ford Trade School picnic. I have a date with Jean Card. She is 15 and cute, and not there when I arrive at her house. I endure small talk from her hostile older brother while waiting for her to finish a babysitting job. We are late. We missed the 4 o'clock boat. She apologizes profusely, but I don't really mind. We walk hand in hand around downtown Detroit and then catch the 6 o'clock boat. We eat her picnic lunch, dainty little triangular sandwiches, oranges already peeled and parted, homemade cookies as we glide down the river. Even the McLogan Steel Company and the Wyandotte Chemical Works look good as the sun sets behind their belching smokestacks. And catch up with the guys on the island. And return on the last boat, close dancing on the moonlit deck. Why do we young have to fight miserable wars when there are so many more pleasant things we could be doing? Lost my youth before it really got going. So that's a little vignette. Boy soldier replacement. His first combat experience. We went on, we were relieved from that duty, and we went patrol the mountains east and west of Clark Field. That was supposed to be light duty, but I have chapters on that. And then we went north. We began a drive up Highway 4, chasing after General Yamashita. On the 9th day of that campaign, I was wounded. I was evacuated by air. I spent 89 days in the hospital. Some on and some on late. While I was in the hospital, they dropped the atomic bomb. I have a chapter in my book called Thank God for the Atomic Bomb. That's why I feel it might be slightly less because there were a lot of people here. I also detail the invasion plans for the American Army invading Japan. My wound was a flesh wound. I was returned to duty. I would have landed on the Tokyo plane in March 1946. Yep. The war ended. Anyway, I was returned to duty, and of course a lot of the older men went home. I had only been in a year, so I had to go to Korea with the Army of Occupation, because that's where they sent the 6th Infantry Division. I always like to read this passage, because it's such a contrast, you know. The typical veteran is not in combat. He drove a truck, cooked, worked, the doctor, whatever it's called. The Army has many ordinary jobs. So the man in the foxhole is really one of to Korea, I was on an LST. I was given the job of helping the bakers. There was an Army baker and a Navy baker. I did the grip work. So I like to read this passage. It's a big contrast to the combat passage. Unlike the troop ships I had been on before, where the Army and the Navy were kept separate, we were bumped in with the enlisted crew along the sides of the ship. We shared their quarters, we ate our meals with them. It was a higher standard of living than I was accustomed to in the Army. The officers, of course, had a separate quarters and a dining room with a black Navy steward to wait on them. There were nearly 200 people on board this LST, half Army, half Navy. The reason I know this is because I was assigned to work in bakery. I was on that thing for 21 days. Well, I didn't do much the first night or two because of seasickness. After I got my sea legs, we settled into a regular routine. I would report to the galley about 7 o'clock in the evening after the kitchen was cleaned up, supper dishes. First order of business was to get rid of the load of the previous day's bread. Usually it was a few loaves. Although there was a lot of seasickness, there was plenty of bread left over. Throw it all overboard, the Navy baker would say, not wanting any day-old bread contaminating the fresh bread locker. He was a slim, blonde-haired, youthful-looking sailor from Ohio who had been a baker in civilian life, so was quite expert in culinary arts. There was also an Army baker, a big Southerner who was not as skilled, having learned the trade at the Army's Cooks and Bakers School. He was also at a disadvantage because it was the Navy baker's kitchen. He was an Army man, or I should say galley. He was an Army man in the position of having to go along with the Navy way of doing things. My job was to do the grub work. Besides throwing yesterday's bread overboard, we used the ocean to dispose of any trash or garbage we generated. I fetched the flour, sugar, butter, open cans, washed the pans, mixing bowls, any other thing that needed cleaning. After a while, they let me do some of the more important work, like spreading frosting on gigantic sheet cakes, or painting equally large pies with condensed milk, so that they came out of the ovens with that glistening golden coloration that made them so appetizing. I used a regular 2-inch paintbrush to do this. We always made a dessert or two every night, and sometimes cinnamon rolls for breakfast. However, the most important job was baking the bread. The Navy baker fussed and fumed, worried about his bread. I think the desserts, which I found more fascinating to make, much more satisfying to eat, were only a sideline to the baker. His formula for the staff of life was half a loaf of bread per man per day. There was something like 194 men aboard the ship. That meant baking 100 loaves every night. It was the first thing we started early in the evening, and the last thing out of the oven. He began by mixing up a huge mass of flour, water, sugar, salt, shortening, and yeast. The sponge, as it was called, was then placed in the warmest part of the galley and covered with moist towels while we turned our attention to the dessert making. Fermentation process over time would cause the leaven dough to rise and expand until it resembled a huge mushroom head. The baker would check it periodically, muttering about its progress and how difficult it was to make good bread when the ship rolled in the high seas. When the sponge rose to its peak, he would uncover it, roll it, knead it, pound it down to a smaller size by force out the carbon dioxide from the fermentation. He would then recover it with moist towels and allow it to rise again. He did this 3 times in the course of the evening. It was often close to midnight before he was satisfied that the dough was ready for baking. This, of course, was too much for the Army baker, who thought some of these steps were unnecessary. He said so. It went unheeded, though, kind of like a daughter telling her mother to throw out the old family recipe and buy a commercial product instead. When the dough was declared ready, we would cut it up into 1-pound pieces. They had to be carefully weighed and modified to ensure uniformity before they were placed in the baking tins. These were multi-cavity, holding 8 molds each. Baking took about a half hour, so by the time the bread was finished, the loaves put away, and the pans washed, usually 2 o'clock in the morning, left the galley. The aroma of freshly baked bread still hanging in the air. I can still remember it. Or anything that smells sweet. So that'll give you a flavor of what this book is about. It's about being in the Army 2 years, being in combat, but also enduring all the other things that the Army have to go through. You know, a lot of people have told me their dad was in the Army. They hardly ever talked about it. Well, I wrote this book because, you know, my dad was in the Navy in World War I. And he was a fireman. Steam engine troop ship. And then he shoveled holes in the hull of the ship. He died in 1958, so, you know, we don't know much about it. The actual day-to-day experience. I have a veteran friend in Hillsdale whose grandfather was in the Civil War, and he wrote a little journal, you know, describing how he joined the Army, Michigan Regiment in Hillsdale. He took a train to Detroit, did a little drilling, then he went off to combat. The best part of it, he didn't write. All he had was a few pages. When I retired from my engineering career, I decided to be a writer, and I took courses. I thought, I'll write a memoir. At least my children and my grandchildren will have a cool story here. I did. So that's what I set out to do. You know, your memory only takes you so far. I did 9 years of research in the National Archives, the Army camp I had served in. I wrote this book, and of course I submitted it to 40 publishers, and the rejection, so I published it myself. Conclusion of my thought. Over here, and if you have any questions, we'll have a common question answering session.
Thank you very much, Russ. One of the things I was very impressed about when I saw Russ's book was that he has on the front of it the Combat Infantryman's badge. I think anyone who's ever been in combat knows that you get recognized sometimes with Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts in your case, and Army commendation medals, but I think for me and for a lot of the people I served with in Vietnam, the one most important badge for them was the Combat CIB, the Combat Infantryman's badge. If nothing else, that badge alone said, I was there, I did something. And it took me 30 days before I eventually won the Combat Infantryman's badge. And so when I saw that on the front of your book, I was very pleased to see that symbol, because it's a very meaningful symbol to many combat veterans. Russ's experiences and mine were very much the same and very much different. We were certainly in 2 different wars. In his case, we were in the general area, the South Pacific, not in Southeast Asia. In my case, I was older when I was drafted. I had been a teacher for 2.5 years. And to be honest with you, during the Vietnam War, a lot of people went to college to avoid the draft, and that was me. I was going to go to college anyway, but I still, to avoid the draft was part of the things that people did. I went into teaching, and I became a history and English teacher. And I've been teaching for 2.5 years when the Army went through and cleaned up in 1969 all the untidy areas, all the people who'd kind of been getting over. And I was one of the people, and they drafted 8 teachers from our school. They drafted me 30 days before I turned 26. If I'd have been 26, I wouldn't have had to go, so that was bad luck. And people said to me, Schneider, with your education, they'll never put you in the infantry. Well, I was assigned not only 1 infantry unit, but 2 infantry units eventually. And they said, Schneider, and this was in an advanced infantry training, they said, Schneider, they're going to send you to Germany. So I actually went out and bought a little Brownie Hawkeye camera to take pictures along the Rhine, so I could bring the pictures back and show them to my kids and say, look, I've been there, I've seen this. Well, they took away my heavy Army overcoat and they gave me tropic disease shots, and I was sent to Vietnam. On the plane going over, people around me, it took 23 hours to fly from the United States to Vietnam, people around me said, Schneider, you can type, can't you? I said, yeah, I'm college educated. I can type 20, 25 words a minute with very few mistakes. And they said, when you get off this airplane, they said, they're going to ask who can type. You're going to raise your hand. The rest of us are going to be in the jungles, and you're going to be in an office typing someplace. So I got to be honest with you, when I got off the airplane, I had my hand in the air ready to volunteer to show my typing skills to anyone. That particular day, the Army didn't need any typing soldiers. They needed shooting soldiers, and I ended up in the 1st Infantry Division. And like Russ, we went out into the jungles, and we went on what is known as search and destroy, but the Army eventually changed it to search and clear because the word destroy sounded bad. But that's what we did. We went out, we looked for the enemy, and they looked for us. My particular unit was one that would go out in groups of 20 to 25 people, and then we'd break down into 12 or 6 people, and we'd hide in the jungles, and when the enemy would walk down the trails, we would blow them up, or they'd shoot us, or whatever would happen to be a firefight. In the book that I wrote, From Classrooms to Claymores, the classrooms I think is obvious, but claymores are a small bomb that almost about as big as this book, and they have 750 pellets in the front, and in the back they've got 1.5 pounds of explosives. And basically they're set up like this, so that when the enemy is charging at you, you run a wire back to your position, and when the enemy charges at you, you blow, you have an electrical charge goes through a placard, goes down the wire, and blows this and can kill the enemy. That's how they stopped mass charges after Korea. If you remember in Korea, there were the poor GIs were trying to shoot everybody that came at them. With this, they were able to make a much better defensive weapon. But you could also put it alongside a trail, and when an enemy walked down the trail, you could hook it up to a battery, and you could also, it was an automatic ambush. When Russ describes his first experience with combat, I got to tell you, I appreciate and understand a lot of what he said. After a while, I knew every day we would walk down a trail, and sometimes we'd see traces of the enemy, or sometimes we'd feel the enemy was there. It sounds silly, but some of the older people could even smell the enemy, and that was because of some of the drugs that they smoked or some of the other things like that. We could smell those people. But I was new, and I was a replacement like you were. And you know, you're the new guy, you're untested, people look at you like, what can this guy do? What, is he any good? The first combat experience I had was where there was actually shooting, was where we were asleep at night. We had moved into an area, and the next morning we were supposed to charge into a bunker complex, but we got to the area so late that they put us in, and we kind of found a place in the jungle to hide. And being a new guy, they put me on what was considered the safe part of the circle, and I was in the back part that didn't face the trail. Well, during the middle of the night, the enemy tried to sneak out of the area and use an old trail that came along parallel to where we were. Everybody in the circle was supposed to be within arm's length and touch the person next to him and wake him up if something happened. The man to my right fell asleep on a nest of red ants, and you talked about the bugs bothering you. And so he moved off the nest of red ants and didn't wake me up. My first experience was our claymores going off as we blew up the enemy. And we kaboom, kaboom, kaboom. Well, I sat straight up in my sleeping blanket. I didn't have my glasses on. I had actually broken a rule. I had taken my boots off. You were not supposed to do that, but my feet were so sore, and I just was wet. And I took them off, and I had put my glasses in my boot. I grabbed the boot and put my glasses on, jammed the boots on, and around me, nothing but noise, smoke, and gunfire was flying. I turned to the person next to me, who was a seasoned grunt, and I said, "What's going on? Are we being attacked?" He said, "No, we're blowing a bush," meaning and we have an ambush that we're firing at them. Turn around and face the outside of the circle. So I went to grab my gun, and he grabbed it at the same time. We had both been disoriented, and we did kind of one of these with the gun, and I said, yours is on your other side. So he grabbed his gun, and we turned around, and we faced the jungle. Behind me, gunfire raged, but in front of me, it was serene. People have asked what combat's like. If you've ever been in a near miss in a traffic accident, you know how your heart flutters, and you know how you go, and then you usually cuss the guy, person out, you know. But you know that feeling. Combat is like experiencing that feeling every few minutes. Your heart beats something, you're trying to evaluate the danger. In this case, the danger was behind me, and I was sure I was going to be shot in the back. And I thought, oh my God, what, my first firefight, and what happens, I go home shot in the back, people think I was running away. That's a disgraceful thing. And I don't know about you, Russ, but I know that a lot of things I did in Vietnam, I did because of social pressure as much as anything else. I would get off the helicopters, I would charge hills, I would do things because the other people did it. And sometimes I said, well, why did I do that? And I knew I had done it because the other men in the unit had done it, and I didn't want to be different. I was sort of a lemming. As a replacement, eventually I think I won the respect of other people. There was an incident, I'm not going to describe it, but an incident where I went out and found, by luck, not by design, I had found a cache. The cache was a storage area of weapons. And I found that more or less by luck. And part of that was because, to be honest with you, I had watched some of the World War II movies, Vic Sanders and Combat, and Vic Morrow and Combat, some of those others where you'd seen those guys go out and do certain things. That was my learning. We had been trained in combat techniques in Fort Leonard Wood and eventually at Fort Garden. But basically, you learn from the people around you. I think we all had a chance to see and experience sad things. But I got to tell you something else, and that is, men, when they're away from home, sometimes do things that they're not supposed to do, some of which are not sexual, by the way, and they involve things that are kind of funny. I tried to bring a few of those things out in my book, too. One of the things I tried to bring out was, well, for example, we received mail from home. And I was one of the resupply sergeants in the field, and so I went over and I got everybody's packages and handed them out to people. And finally I had one. It wasn't real big, so I went and opened it up eventually. And I'll be honest with you, this sounds terrible, but I would always like to share other people's cookies, but when I had cookies or stuff from home, I kind of wanted to hide those myself. Well, I opened up this package, and it was not cookies. It was a box of Russ chocolate-covered cherries. Now, folks, we had been without cherries and candy, anything of that nature, for about 6 months, and suddenly they have a box of Russ chocolate-covered cherries. I looked at it, and I wanted to hide it, but everybody goes, Schneider's got candy. All the people in our platoon ran over. They said, open it, open it. I said, get away, get away. I got to get my water, I got to get my ammunition. I said, get away, get away. And we took and we put the box on our rucksack. And people walked by back and forth looking at that. Because Army's definition of candy is take a little chocolate, mix it with a whole lot of wax, and put it together and put this Hershey stamp on it. You might as well go and eat a candle is what it amounts to. There's so much paraffin. But that's the Army definition of candy. So eventually we opened it up. And if you can recall the picture on a box of chocolate covered cherries. On the outside there's the chocolate, and then they have one of them broken apart, and there's a nougat, and then there's cherries inside. You know, we stood there and our mouth was just watering. The anticipation of what we were about to eat. We opened it up, and just as the top of the box cleared the box itself, the lid came off. We looked in, and there was the chocolate-covered cherries, covered with maggots. It was the most disgusting sight you've ever seen. But it was more as disgusting as it was heartbreaking. We had not had world food, as we call it in the United States. We had not had world food in so long. To see this, we looked at it. It was so incongruous. The picture and the cherries. Picture and the cherries. To be honest with you, we put it back on there. And there was some swearing that took place. There was some therapeutic cussing, if you want to call it that. Well, we set it over on the side, and we went about our business. And a group from one of the people from another platoon, and we were in a circle at that time taking resupply, came over and said, "Hey, check it out." how about those chocolate covered cherries? Can I have some? And I said, not either. My mother sent me those. The guy says, I'll give you $10 for them. I said, what? You'll give me $10 to eat what's in that box of chocolate covered cherries? He said, yeah, man, I will. I said, let me see that money. And so he took his money out of his pocket and gave it to me. I'm afraid I was feeling mean that day because I let him take it. He took it over to his part of the circle and you heard, oh, hey, man, only to hear, oh, gosh darn, gee whiz, and other words like that. But he came back and I was reading a letter from my parents and he said, I want my money back. Well, I was sitting there and to be honest with you, he said, get away from me. I'm not, you said you'd give me $10 to eat what's in there. Get out of here. He went back and a few minutes later he came back with 2 or 3 of his buddies. They both had their guns, all 3 of them had their guns. And I thought, oh my God. Because people over in Nam would get fragged or shot for less. Some of my friends in my platoon walked behind him and one of them took a 45 and cocked it to cover him. And the guy stood there and kicked my feet. He said, listen, you sold me those chocolates for $10. I said, I just sold them for 15. Now the story would have stopped there, except about an hour later, that box of chocolate-covered cherries had made a complete circle, and a young man, a young trooper, came through, and guess what he was carrying? A box of chocolate-covered cherries. And he kind of was doing one of those, oh, don't look, but I got some for you to see, don't look. And we said, hey, what have you got? He said, I got some chocolate-covered cherries my mom sent me. Well, by that time, we were roaring with laughter, and in combat, I don't know how you were, but we were never told to talk above the whisper. And we were just laughing. I mean, we were laying on the jungle floor, just crying and laughing so hard. We said, we'll bet you that there's chocolate. We'll bet you $100 that those chocolate-covered cherries are covered with maggots. And he goes, how'd you know? How'd you know, man? And we said, well, and about that time, the captain was really angry with us. He sent one of his assistants over to yell at us for being noisy. The guy walked in and said, you guys said, what have you got? He said, chocolate-covered cherries. Go give them to the captain. I don't know what happened to the chocolate-covered cherries after that, but that was one of the things that happened, a minor incident, a very major war. I tried to bring in my book out some of the human things that people did that were funny, some of the things that were humorous, some of the things that were sad, some of the things that happened to us when we were far away from home. I was very fortunate because I sent the letters back to my family and said, save these. Someday I might write a book. And my idea was to write a political book. But I got to be honest with you, this 11 Bravo grunt, I never knew what was happening to me. I followed the guy in front of me. I went out on missions. I never knew what hill I was going up or what hill I was going down. When people shot at you, you fell down, you shot back. So all kinds of things happened to us. And when I came back, I never really knew what the grand picture was. I knew in 1970, the workers, the people over there, the combat soldiers, had no reason for being there, no purpose. We were just putting in 1 year. You know, it wasn't 3 or 4 years. It was 365 days. We got on a Freedom Bird and we flew home. All you had to do was survive. If you could get a rear job or an easy job, you did it. And eventually, I did get a company clerk job. I showed some responsibility and did some things in the field that people thought were good, and so and some of, I think, my leadership may have emerged, and I became a company clerk. But basically, the time I spent there was the time in the field that I think was some of the most dramatic of my life. I took some slides while I was over there, and if you don't mind, I'm going to show you a few of them, and hopefully you can see them on the screen. They're things that really shaped a lot of who I am, and really are very typical of the kinds of things that people would have while they're over there. This is a picture of the Vietnam Wall, and I don't know if you've ever been to the Vietnam Wall or not. I've been there 3